My new boss looked me dead in the eye over that video call and said, "Look, Stewart, if you don't like the direction we're taking this company, maybe you'd be happier somewhere that still does things the old way." He didn't say resign. He was too careful for that. But we both knew what he meant. I sat there for a moment looking at his face on my screen, that particular kind of smile that people wear when they think they've already won, and I thought about the 7 years I'd spent building something real inside that company. 7 years of early mornings and late nights and solving problems that nobody else in that building even understood well enough to name. Then I thought about the folder on my personal laptop, the one I'd been quietly adding to for the past 14 months. I unmuted myself. "Thanks for the clarity," I said, and I meant it. "My name is Stewart Caldwell. I'm 51 years old. I spent the better part of 2 decades as a senior software architect at a mid-sized logistics company in Columbus, Ohio. Not glamorous work. Nobody's putting logistics software on the cover of Wired magazine. But the kind of work that keeps supply chains moving, that keeps goods on shelves, that quietly holds enormous pieces of the economy together while everyone ignores it. I was good at it. I knew I was good at it. More importantly, the company knew it too, right up until the moment they decided that didn't matter anymore. The trouble started when the private equity group that had owned us for 3 years decided to bring in new leadership. Our longtime CEO retired in March, and by April we had a new one. His name was Marcus Webb. 43 years old, came out of a consulting background, had spent the previous 6 years doing operational transformations, which is a phrase that means different things depending on who's using it, but in my experience almost always means the same thing: cut costs, consolidate headcount, and get out before the consequences arrive. Marcus was sharp. I'll give him that. He had good posture and a firm handshake, and he said all the right things in his first all-hands meeting about culture and collaboration and unlocking value. He wore the kind of suit that cost more than my first car. I didn't trust him from the first week, not because of anything he said. It was something smaller. In his second week, he sat in on one of our architecture review sessions, the kind of 3-hour deep dive where we'd map out system dependencies and flag technical debt. Halfway through, when my colleague started walking him through the routing optimization engine I'd designed, Marcus nodded along and then said, "Great. So, how do we productize this?" He didn't ask how it worked. He didn't ask what problem it solved, or what it had taken to build it. He asked how to sell it. That told me everything I needed to know. Now, I have to back up here, because the thing that ultimately saved me didn't start with Marcus Webb. It started about 14 months before he ever walked through our doors. I've always had side projects. That's just how my brain works. I think about problems constantly, and sometimes the problems I find most interesting aren't the ones on my official job description. About 2.5 years ago, I started working on a route deviation alert system in my own time, not for the company, not using company equipment. I did it on my personal MacBook, at my kitchen table, on weekends and evenings, because I found the problem genuinely interesting. The basic idea was this: most logistics software flags exceptions after they happen. A shipment misses a waypoint, the system alerts you, you scramble. What I wanted to build was something that could identify the conditions that predict a deviation before the deviation occurs, pulling in weather data, traffic patterns, carrier performance history, real-time fuel pricing, and surface a probability score early enough to actually do something about it. I called it Meridian, just because I needed to call it something. I worked on it for about 8 months before it was anything worth showing anyone. By month 10, I had a working prototype. By month 12, I had documented test results showing a 34% reduction in exception handling costs when the system's recommendations were followed. Here's what I also did. Starting from day 1, I kept meticulous records. Every line of code written on personal time, on personal hardware, with no company resources. Dated commit logs in a private repository. A paper notebook, actual paper, where I logged hours worked and what I accomplished each session. I have entries going back to a Tuesday night in February, where I wrote 2.5 HARs, worked on carrier scoring model, kids' school play tomorrow. I did all of this because I've been in this industry long enough to know how these stories go. I'd seen it happen to a friend of mine. Back in the early 2000s, brilliant guy built something extraordinary on his own time, and when his employer found out about it, they claimed it was theirs. He fought for 3 years. He won eventually, but it cost him his savings and his marriage. I told myself a long time ago that if I ever built something worth fighting over, I wasn't going to fight unprepared. About 14 months before Marcus Webb arrived, I sat down with an IP attorney in Columbus named, well, I'll just say she's very good at her job. We went through my employment contract line by line. We reviewed the Ohio Employee Invention Statute. We documented everything. She sent me a formal opinion letter stating that Meridian was entirely my personal intellectual property, developed independently, outside the scope of my employment, on personal time and equipment. I put that letter in a folder on my laptop. I made 3 printed copies and stored them in separate locations. Then I went back to work and didn't think about it for over a year. Marcus moved fast, I'll give him that. By his 3rd month, he'd already reorganized 2 departments and replaced 4 senior managers with people he'd brought in from his previous firm. By month 4, he announced a new initiative he was calling the Integrated Solutions Portfolio. Essentially, the company was going to start packaging its internal software tools and licensing them to other logistics companies. In principle, I didn't have a problem with that. Some of our tools were genuinely good. License them out, generate recurring revenue, makes sense. What I did have a problem with was the new IP policy that Marcus's team quietly inserted into our employee handbook that same month. I almost missed it. It was buried in a section on digital assets and proprietary information, sandwiched between the acceptable use policy and the section on company-issued devices. The new language stated that any technology, algorithm, software, or process developed by an employee that is related to, adjacent to, or capable of integration with the company's existing or planned product portfolio was to be considered company property, regardless of when, where, or how it was developed. Regardless of when, where, or how it was developed. I read that sentence 4 times. Then I forwarded it to my attorney. She called me back within the hour. They can't retroactively apply this to things you built before the policy existed, she said. And even prospectively, this is an overreach that wouldn't hold up in Ohio. But I want you to know it's in writing now, and I want you to be careful. I asked her what careful looked like. It looks like not volunteering information, she said. Don't show them Meridian. Don't mention Meridian. If they find out about it through other means and make a claim, we are ready to respond. But don't hand them the opportunity. I thanked her and kept my head down. For about 6 more weeks. The thing about working with a team of smart engineers is that things get out eventually. One of my colleagues, a younger guy on my team, good instincts, I'd mentored him for about 2 years, knew I'd been working on something. He'd seen me reference it obliquely in some technical conversations. He wasn't malicious about it. He was excited. He thought it was impressive. And in a casual lunch conversation with one of Marcus's new directors, he mentioned that I had a route optimization tool I'd been developing that was getting some impressive test results. I found out 3 days later when Marcus himself asked me to stay on after a department meeting. I hear you've been working on something interesting, he said. Just the 2 of us in the conference room. Same easy smile as always. A deviation prediction tool? I kept my face neutral. I've been doing some independent research on that problem space, yes. How far along is it? It's a working prototype. He leaned back. Stewart, that sounds like exactly the kind of thing that fits into what we're building with the ISP. I'd love to see a demo. We should talk about how we bring this into the product portfolio. And there it was. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, I'd want to make sure we're aligned on the ownership question before we have that conversation. Something shifted in his expression. Not much. But I saw it. What do you mean, ownership question? The tool was developed on personal time, on personal equipment, before the new IP policy was in place. I'd want to make sure any conversation about bringing it into the company is framed correctly, as a licensing discussion or an acquisition, rather than an internal handoff. He smiled again, slower this time. I think you might be misreading the policy. I'd be happy to have my attorney and your legal team get on a call to make sure we're all reading it the same way, I said. Brief silence. Let's just start with a demo, he said. No need to get the lawyers involved at this stage. I'd prefer to get clarity on the framework first, I said. We ended the meeting shortly after that. Politely. Professionally. But when I walked back to my desk, I knew something had changed. The next 3 weeks were quiet, in the specific way that precedes something loud. Marcus didn't bring up Meridian again. His new director stopped stopping by my desk. I noticed I was suddenly not included in 2 planning meetings I'd always been part of. These are the small signals, the kind that people who've never been in this situation might miss. I've been working long enough not to miss them. I made an appointment to update my attorney. They're building a case to push you out, she said. or they're going to try to claim the IP through your employment relationship. Either way, we need to make sure your documentation is bulletproof. We spent 2 hours going through everything again. Commit timestamps. Personal bank statements showing the hardware purchases. The paper notebook with dated entries. Correspondence with a beta tester at a small freight company in Indiana who had been using a version of Meridian for 3 months. Correspondence that predated the new IP policy entirely. My attorney filed a formal protective disclosure notice with the company's legal department. It was a quiet document, technical language, but what it said was simple. This is what Meridian is. This is when it was created. This is why it belongs to me, and we are placing you on notice that any attempt to claim ownership will be disputed. I don't know exactly what happened when that letter hit the legal department's inbox. I wasn't there. But I know what happened next. 2 days later, Marcus called me into his office and told me that my role was being restructured. Effective in 60 days, my position would be eliminated. I would receive a severance package per company policy, 8 weeks. I want to be transparent with you, he said. This is about organizational alignment, not performance. I nodded. I said I appreciated the transparency. Then I went back to my desk and called my attorney. She had 3 words. This is retaliation. Here's what I knew, and Marcus apparently didn't. Ohio has specific protections against retaliatory termination, and the timing was not subtle. Within 48 hours of a formal IP protection notice, I was handed a termination. That is the kind of sequence of events that employment attorneys find very interesting. My attorney sent a second letter. This one outlined the timeline explicitly. IP notice filed, termination announced 2 days later. It cited the relevant Ohio statutes. It noted that the company's stated reason, organizational restructuring, was inconsistent with the fact that my position had been publicly listed as part of the ISP initiative just 6 weeks prior. It requested that the company reconsider the termination, extend my employment, and cease any further attempts to claim ownership of Meridian. It also noted that if the matter proceeded to litigation, the discovery process would likely be quite thorough. I want to be clear that I am not someone who likes conflict. I don't enjoy this kind of maneuvering. I spent most of those weeks sleeping poorly, second-guessing myself, wondering if I was making things worse. I have a mortgage. I have a daughter starting college in 2 years. The last thing I wanted was a legal fight, but I had done the preparation. I'd done it years before I needed it, precisely so that when the moment came, I wouldn't be scrambling. The company's legal team went quiet for 9 days. On the 10th day, my attorney got a call from their outside counsel. They wanted to negotiate. What followed was a process I'll compress here because the details are genuinely boring. 4 weeks of back and forth, drafts and counter-drafts, my attorney earning every cent of her fee. What we arrived at was this. My termination was rescinded. I returned to my position with no break-in service. The IP policy was revised. The language about adjacent and capable of integration was removed. The new version was, frankly, reasonable. It covered things actually developed on company time and with company resources, which is what a sensible IP policy covers. Meridian remained mine. Entirely. The company was given the option to license it at a fair market rate, structured over 3 years, with renewal terms that I control. They accepted, and Marcus Webb left the company 4 months later, when the private equity group apparently determined that his operational transformation had created more legal exposure than value. I heard that secondhand from a former colleague. I wasn't there for that meeting. I didn't need to be. The morning after my attorney called to tell me the agreement was finalized, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and looked out at my backyard for a long time. My daughter came downstairs and asked what I was thinking about. I told her I'd been working on something for a long time, longer than it turned out I needed to work on it, and that it had finally paid off. She asked what it was. I said it was kind of like keeping an umbrella in your car every single day, even when the forecast is clear, and then one afternoon, the sky opens up and everyone around you is getting soaked and you're perfectly dry. She looked at me the way 20-year-olds look at their parents when they're being philosophical before 9 a.m. "Dad," she said, "do you want me to make more coffee?" Yes, I did. I'm telling the story not because I want credit. I don't particularly like being the center of attention, which is part of why it took me a long time to decide to share this publicly. I'm telling it because of a conversation I had with a junior developer at my company about a month after everything settled. Smart kid, early 30s, has a couple of side projects he works on at night. He'd heard through the grapevine that something had happened with Marcus and the IP policy, and he asked me about it. I gave him the short version. Then I asked him one question. Do you have documentation that everything you've built on your own is actually yours? He looked at me like it hadn't occurred to him to worry about that. Get an attorney, I said. Spend a few $100s now. Document everything. Date stamp your commits. Keep a log. Get a written opinion. You may never need it, but if you ever do need it, you will be so glad you did it before you needed it. He nodded slowly. And read your employment contract, I added. All of it, not just where they tell you to sign. That's really the whole lesson. There's no clever trick here, no dramatic confrontation moment, no speech I gave in a conference room that changed everything. The moment that mattered happened at my kitchen table on a random Wednesday evening, 3 years before Marcus Webb ever showed up, when I decided to be careful with something I'd built. The people who try to take what isn't theirs are counting on you to be unprepared. They're counting on the paperwork gap, the verbal agreement, the handshake, understanding that seemed fine at the time. I didn't give them that gap. That's it. That's the whole story. I documented the process. I had time for the results. I've been thinking a lot lately about the gap between what people prepare for and what actually happens to them. Most of us walk into careers believing that doing good work is enough, that if you're competent, if you show up, if you build real things that solve real problems, the institution around you will recognize that and protect it. I believed that too for a long time. I'm not sure exactly when I stopped believing it, but I think it was somewhere around the time I watched a friend lose 3 years of his life fighting for something that should have been obviously, legally, undeniably his. What Marcus tried to do wasn't unusual. That's the uncomfortable truth. The move. Bring in new leadership, rewrite the IP policy, absorb whatever the talented people have quietly been building, and restructure out anyone who pushes back. It's a playbook. It has been for years. It works so often precisely because most people aren't prepared for it. Most people assume good faith until it's too late to do anything about the bad faith they're standing in. I got lucky in one specific way. I happened to have seen it happen to someone else first. That's what drove me to the attorney's office 3 years before I needed her. Not paranoia, not cynicism, just the honest recognition that the things we build with our own hands, on our own time, with our own minds, those things are worth protecting deliberately, not just hoping they stay safe. What strikes me now, looking back, is that nothing about the outcome was accidental. Marcus didn't fail because of bad luck. He failed because every step he took was built on an assumption that wasn't true, that I hadn't documented anything, that the policy language would hold, that the timing of my termination wouldn't look exactly like what it was. Each of those assumptions collapsed because I had spent years making sure they would collapse if he ever tested them. There's something I want to say carefully here, because I don't want it to sound like I'm congratulating myself. The preparation wasn't the impressive part. The impressive part, if there is one, was the discipline of doing it before there was any urgency. When I sat down with my attorney the first time, nothing was wrong. My job was fine. Nobody was threatening anything. It would have been completely reasonable to think, I'll deal with that if it ever comes up. Most people make that choice. I understand why. But I'd seen what if it ever comes up. Looks like when you're unprepared. It looks like scrambling. It looks like paying an attorney twice as much to reconstruct a paper trail that should have existed from the beginning. It looks like settling for less than you deserve because litigation is expensive and exhausting and you can't afford to wait it out. Integrity, to me, isn't just about doing the right thing when someone's watching. It's about doing the quiet, unsexy, nobody will ever know you did this work that protects your ability to do the right thing when it actually matters. Keeping that notebook. Dating those commits. Making those 3 printed copies. My daughter asked me once what the whole thing was really about. Not the legal mechanics. She's smart. She understood those. But what it was about. I told her it was about not letting someone else's bad decision become your emergency. She's 20. She's about to go out into a world full of people who will occasionally try to claim things that aren't theirs. I hope she remembers that conversation. I hope she remembers that the people who navigate those moments well usually started preparing for them long before the moment arrived. The work you do in the quiet before anything is at stake, that's the work that holds when everything else gets loud.